Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Nobel Laureate Master Forum and Honorary Doctorate Conferment Ceremony at Asia University. Today's event is jointly organized by Asia University, the International Peace Foundation, and the TAIWAN BRIDGES program. We're deeply honored to welcome Dr. Thomas Südhof, recipient of the 2013 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. His presence marks an inspiring beginning to our academic programs in 2026. 各位贵宾，大家午安，欢迎莅临亚洲大学诺贝尔大师论坛暨名誉博士学位颁授典礼。本次活动由亚洲大学国际和平组织及台湾桥梁计划共同主办。我们非常荣幸邀请到2013年诺贝尔生理医学奖得主 Thomas Südhof 教授莅临本校，为2026年亚大学术活动揭开序幕。In addition to the forum, Asia University is honored to confer upon Professor Südhof the honorary doctorate in recognition of his outstanding contributions to neuroscience. This conferment holds special significance as Asia University enters its 25th anniversary this year. 除了诺贝尔大师论坛之外，亚洲大学已隆重举行名誉博士学位颁授典礼，以表彰Südhof教授在神经科学领域的卓越贡献，同时也为本校迈入创校第25周年增添光彩。Before we proceed, allow me to introduce our distinguished guests today. First, let's welcome Professor Jeffrey J.P. Tsai, President of Asia University. 我们欢迎亚洲大学校长蔡进发蔡教授。Professor Thomas Südhof, recipient of the 2013 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. 我们欢迎我们的 Thomas 教授。And Mr. Uva Mohavets, Chairman of International Peace Foundation. 我们欢迎国际和平组织主席 Mohavets 先生。Academician Hong Ming-Qi, Academician of Academia Sinica, also the former president of China Medical University. 我们欢迎中央研究院院士洪明启教授。Professor Cai Xiufen, Vice President of Asia University. 欢迎。Professor Ke Huizhen, also Vice President of Asia University. 我们欢迎亚洲大学副校长柯慧珍教授。Professor Huang Junjie, Vice President of Asia University. 我们欢迎黄副校长。Professor Shi Nengyi, Vice President of Asia University. 欢迎施副校长。Professor Susan Hu, Dean of the College of Health Sciences of Asia University. 我们欢迎胡淑珍副院长。Thank you all. And next, we invite you to watch an introduction video highlighting the academic journey and distinguished contributions of our honorary doctorate recipient, Professor Thomas Südhof. 接下来，让我们透过影片一同来回顾本次名誉博士2013年诺贝尔生理医学奖得主 Südhof 教授的学术历程与卓越贡献。
Congratulations. May I now ask you to step forward to receive the Nobel Prize from the hands of His Majesty the King.
We won't understand illnesses if we don't understand why people are sick. I think one of the biggest mistakes in health research is that the emphasis is very much placed on working on the illnesses themselves. This costs a lot of money, which often sounds very good, but this ultimately amounts to nothing because you can't really treat an illness if you don't know what you're supposed to treat. Hi, my name is Thomas Südhof. I am a professor at Stanford University in California, where I live.
Ich bin das, was man im
I'm what you might call a nerd.
schon als Jugendlicher.
Even as a kid, I had a tendency to call the official version of events, of facts, into question.
Tatsachen zu bezweifeln, würde mich also.
So I consider myself someone who's been something of a rebel from an early age.
Aufgrund dieser Neigung.
This predisposition resulted in my being very independent, already when I was quite young. This included my hitchhiking my way around Europe as a 14-year-old teenager, which made me rely on myself from an early age.
Schon sehr früh auf mich selbst verlassen. Als ich im Studium war und immer mehr lernte darüber, wie wir.
While I was a student, learning more and more about how we as doctors treat people, I realized that doctors learn to act as though they could help people. But the fact is, we in the field of medicine don't actually know how most illnesses even come about.
Überhaupt entstehen. I
embarked on the project in 1986, and I was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2013.
Im Gehirn kommunizieren die Nervenzellen miteinander.
The nerve cells in the brain communicate with one another by exchanging chemical neurotransmitters. This process involves a nerve cell placing a chemical signal in a small vesicle, and this vesicle then fusing with the cellular membrane, thereby releasing its contents.
Und dadurch den Inhalt ausschüttet. Meine Arbeit befasste sich damit.
My work is about finding out how such a complex process, the fusion of the vesicles, can occur so quickly and so precisely. And in particular, how this is regulated. And that's something which is very important.
Jetzt geht es darum.
What we now need to do is treat brain disease. This is the next major challenge after cancer and cardiovascular disease. We're talking about diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which are all becoming more important, among other things, because people are living for longer.
Das heißt,
if you can successfully treat cancer or prevent heart attacks, it means more people will develop Alzheimer's simply because they are growing older.
In der Forschung ist es immer so, wie in allen anderen.
In the field of research, just like in any human activity, everyone goes in the same direction. Everyone does the same thing. Trends are incredibly widespread in research. I think that to really be successful, you have to break free from trends and go your own way.
We are now honored to invite the president of Asia University, President Jeffrey J.P. Tsai, to deliver the welcome remarks. 我们接下来恭请亚洲大学校长蔡进发校长来致欢迎词，为本次典礼揭开序幕。有请校长。
Nobel Laureate Professor Thomas Südhof, Mr. World Moraways, IPF Chairman, academician Professor Ming-Chi Huang, the former president of China Medical University, distinguished guest, partner from the Taiwan Bridge Program, faculties, students, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all to Asia University for today's Honorary Doctorate Conferment Ceremony and Nobel Laureate Master Forum. I would like to begin by extending a very warm welcome to our distinguished guest and Honorary Professor Thomas Südhof, recipient of 2013 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Professor Südhof groundbreaking discovery on the molecular mechanism of synaptic transmission have fundamentally transformed our understanding of how the brain communicates. His work has not only reshaped modern neuroscience, but has also opened new pathways for research into neurological and psychiatrical disorder. Beyond his remarkable scientific achievement, Professor Südhof's long-life dedication to scientific rigor, integrity, and curiosity represent the very spirit of academic excellence. His personal academic journey stands as an inspiration model for our students and young scholars. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to Mr. Huang Morowitz, Chairman of the International Peace Foundation, for his valuable support and leadership in helping to plan and make today's event possible. Through the efforts of the International Peace Foundation, we are reminded that science, education, and peace share a common purpose to advance humanity through knowledge, dialogue, and mutual understanding. Over the years, Asia University has had the privilege of welcoming 20 Nobel laureates to engage in dialogue with our students, including laureates in economics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine. Through these encounters, we strive to bring the wisdom of the world's greatest mind directly to young learners, inspiring them to think boldly, critically, and ethically about their role in shaping the future. Today, we are especially pleased to welcome not only our university community, but also high school students who represent the next generation of thinkers, scientists, and leaders. We hope that today's ceremony and lecture will spark curiosity, ambition, and lasting appreciation for the value of scientific excellence and integrity. Once again, I thank you all for joining us on this meaningful occasion. Please join me in celebrating the achievements of Professor Thomas Südhof and his making this day a memorable day for Asian University. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, President, for your remarks. They have set a wonderful tone for today's ceremony. 我们谢谢校长的致辞，为今天的典礼揭开序幕。We will now proceed to the laudatio, a central component of the honorary doctorate conferment ceremony, through which we formally acknowledge the scholarly achievements and enduring contribution of our honorary doctorate recipient. It is our honor to invite Professor Susan Hu, Dean of the College of Medical and Health Sciences, to deliver the laudatio。 我们接下来进行表彰词的宣读，我们借此来正式表彰名誉博士在学术和社会上的卓越贡献。我们有请胡淑珍院长，谢谢。
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to present this laudatio for Professor Thomas Südhof, whom Asia University proudly honors today with an honorable doctorate. Professor Südhof is one of the most influential neuroscientists of our time. In 2013, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his groundbreaking discoveries regarding the molecular mechanism of synaptic transmission, work that fundamentally transform our understanding of how neurons communicate. Through decades of rigorous inquiry, Professor Südhof revealed the precise molecular processes that govern neurotransmitter release at synapses. His discoveries laid the cornerstone for modern neuroscience and continue to illuminate the path toward treating neurological and psychiatry disorders. Beyond his scientific achievement, Professor Südhof exemplifies the highest standard of excellence and integrity. His work is marked by clarity, precision, and an unwavering respect for evidence. As a dedicated mentor, he inspires students and young scholars worldwide to pursue science with curiosity, discipline, and ethical responsibility. Professor Südhof's life and work reflect the core values that Asia University seeks to cultivate: excellence in research, a commitment to truth, and a responsibility to society. His career embodies a powerful model for our students and the broader academic community. Therefore, in recognition of his outstanding contribution to neuroscience and his enduring commitment to scientific integrity, Asia University is deeply honored to confer the honorary doctorate upon Mr. Thomas Südhof. Thank you for joining us in honoring Professor Thomas Südhof, Asia University, January 5th, 2026. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hu. We now proceed to a key moment of today's ceremony, the conferral of honorary doctorate. May we invite President Tsai to the stage to proceed with the conferral. 我们接下来典礼进入到本次活动的重要时刻，名誉博士学位颁授，我们恭请校长上台进行授证仪式。We now also invite Professor Thomas Südhof to the stage for the presentation of the honorary doctorate diploma. 我们接着有请名誉博士 Südhof 教授上台，我们来进行名誉博士学位证书颁授。We will now proceed with the tassel turning ceremony. Let's now proceed with the tassel turning. The President will present a commemorative gift to our honorary doctorate recipient. 接下来为了表达亚洲大学最诚挚的敬意与祝贺，将由校长代表本校致赠纪念品给我们的名誉博士。Okay, let's now proceed to another photo. We kindly invite Professor Susan Hu to join us on the stage for a photograph. invite our entire Professor Südhof to step backstage with me to change the gown. And we now invite Professor Susan Hu to introduce the honorary doctorate recipient and prepare us for the lecture.
各位贵宾、各位老师、各位同学哈，趁着他们去换衣服的5分钟，我会简单介绍一下这个整个活动。Dr. Wu, I will use in Chinese because I have only 5 minutes. OK, so 我就大概介绍一下，我们这一次办的活动呢是非常重要的哈，主要是由首先是由我们世界和平基金会发起的，它跟我们的台湾桥梁计划合在一块。那刚刚已经有介绍了，我们 Wen 是世界The International Peace Foundation 的 Chairman。那么台湾桥梁计划呢，是由台湾大学、还有中央研究院以及全国12所学校，还有好多赞助的这些电子业哈，还有一些企业这样子组起来。那么我们主要呢，从去年到今年呢，总共会邀请31位诺贝尔奖得主，所以在全国各主要的学校都会有机会。如果同学们还有兴趣了解的话，就可以上那个IPF 的网站哈，就可以查得到。那我们今天呢，主要邀请的是2013年的生理医学奖的得主，总共有3位。刚刚影片也有秀出来。那么前2位已经来过了哈，然后我们今天的是第3位，他们是Südhof。sorry。好，我简单的来介绍一下Südhof 教授呢，他所以会得奖呢，主要是因为他发现了神经元如何在突触之间的互相沟通，这是一个创举哈。那这些研究呢，会影响了后面的阿兹海默，还有精神疾病跟自闭症的研究。那我们也稍微好奇一下，了解一下一个博士诺贝尔奖得主是如何形成的哈？那Südhof教授呢，他是德国人啊，现在当然是德国美裔啊，德裔美国人哈。那他出生在德国的那个哥廷根这个城市啊，父亲是医师，母亲是老师，从小就对音乐有兴趣，所以呢，他主要是在82年的时候就完成了医学士以及医学博士同时完成。完成了以后呢，到83到86这3年呢，他到美国的德州大学西南医学中心做博士后研究。这3年对他来说是一个非常重要的3年哈，因为他的指导教授，博后的指导教授，在1985年就拿到诺贝尔奖的也是诺贝尔奖得主。所以呢，我们可以看得出来，就是1985他的指导教授博后的得主，然后接着2013就换他得到，所以你就可以知道名师出高徒哈。那我也要稍微强调一下啊，那个Südhof教授从头到尾到博士学位都在德国完成的，所以我们其实对于台湾自己本土的博士，千万不要认为自己是土博士哈，没机会，有的哈可以学习一下我们Südhof教授到国外做博后。那他就开始跟着这个 Dr. Brown and Dr. Goldstein 去做胆固醇代谢的调控，但是他在他的下面呢，学会了基因调控、细胞代谢，还有分子生物跟生化这些技术呢，是奠定他研究神经突触跟囊泡这个运输之间的机制的非常重要。那我好奇的也想知道这2位西南德大的医学中心的2位教授到底是多年轻？你看到了吗？我特别标注了44岁、45岁就拿到诺贝尔奖了哈，真是超年轻的。那我们再来看看Südhof，他后来呢，就3年博后结束后，他就留在德大医学中心、西南医学中心呢，就当研究员，接着一路升到教授，他在那边待了22年。那后来2008他就跳槽到斯坦福大学去了。那从这里面呢，你就可以看得到，他持续也是继续做有关于神经网络如何维持调控，然后也把研究呢往这个自闭症、精神分裂跟神经退化性的疾病。那他2013年得到诺贝尔奖那一年他才58岁也是超年轻的。那现在呢，他是美国斯坦福大学的分子及细胞生理学的教授，也是一个非常重要的一个单位叫 Howard Hughes 的研究员哈。 那他得到非常多的奖项。那么主要的贡献呢是在右手边哈，主要是突触啊、细胞内的囊泡以及精神疾病。那我特别呢去查了一下哈，因为我们今天有很多师生在这边，希望大家能够从他当中学到一些身教言教的哈。所以呢，查了他一下他的科学哲学与名言哈。这两张slide 呢，我放到入口处有2个电子看板。如果等一下秀很快，你们自己到后面去拍照哈。主要呢，他是在探讨，就是说科学研究探索，如果你最好是不要带任何应用的目的，如果你带着应用的目的，你就会限制你的创造力跟想象力。那但是关于创造力跟想象力呢，你首先呢必须要有某方面的技能、技术、媒介，这样的话你才可以发挥。要是你没有的话，就不太就是比较不容易哈变得优秀。那么第3个有关于科学的成就，他是建议真正科学的价值在于观念上的改变啊，并不是只是技术上的更新。那么还有一个很重要的一些令我们可以启发的是，包括第一个，他学音乐，他学的音乐乐器是叫巴松，就是巴松管。那音乐呢，教会了他纪律跟专注啊，因为练习音乐跟做科学一样，从千篇一律很无趣，但是你要能够有这个耐心，有这个毅力啊。那第2个，他也勇于挑战，在当时大家都是在做那个突触接收钱的前面那一端，那他呢就开始做没人做的后面那一端，所以他认为，如果你能够做这个没人做过的事的决心，你就有机会可以有所成就。那第3个部分的话是跨领域的转变他发现说临床医学呢主要是对于疾病的来源认知很少，所以他就认为他是医师，但是他转到基础研究去。他觉得如果我们能够这一份热情他有说他对知识的渴求不是为了名声，实在是想要了解人类大脑如何运作。所以如果各位同学老师们能够秉持一个对知识纯粹的热情，那就可以让大家度过，不要说度过了，跟着你陪伴你几十年的研究工作，还有一些学习。好，我的介绍就到这边。Okay, it is a critical time that I'm honored to invite Professor Südhof come to the stage and give us an enlightened talk. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone here. I would like to thank you all, but in particular, the president of your wonderful university for the invitation to speak to you here today for this incredible ceremony and for the opportunity to communicate to you, with you, talking about some of the issues that we now face in science. And this talk that I'm going to give today is a bit unusual for me and probably for you too, because normally I talk about the science that we do. Today, I will only indirectly touch upon the science that we do and instead talk about a general issue of science culture, in particular, the issue of science integrity and the issue of how we can develop science in future to improve it for generations to come. So the title of my talk is entitled A Personal Journey because I'm going to give you my personal perspective, different from a scientific talk, which I usually give. What I'm telling you is my personal opinion. It is not necessarily an established fact. And I'd be happy to discuss after my talk any aspect of what I'm discussing here with you and to change my mind whenever I might have gotten things wrong. To introduce myself, let me first tell you, as you probably heard just a minute ago, what my lab is trying to do over the last couple of years. And that is to understand the fundamental process of how nerve cells in the brain communicate. In neuroscience, there's a unifying paradigm, the notion of the neural circuit that underlies all brain function. And in a neural circuit, information is not only transferred, but also processed at synapses, which basically take a presynaptic signal and convert it into a postsynaptic signal. And this is really the fundamental goal of our lab. We would like to understand how this works in very general terms. In this respect, I won my Nobel Prize, if it's my Nobel Prize. I don't think it's my Nobel Prize, but anyway, I won a part of the Nobel Prize in 2013 for one component of this overall bigger problem, which is how a presynaptic terminal secretes neurotransmitter signals. And in that work, we discovered that there is a nanomachine at the presynaptic terminal that mediates the emission of a signal, a neurotransmitter signal, that then initiates the computational transfer of a signal from a pre to a postsynaptic neuron. And that nanomachine is composed of three parts: a fusion machinery that was also discovered by James Rothman and Randy Sheckman, my co-recipients of the Nobel Prize, a calcium triggering protein that transduces an electrical signal into the chemical secretion of the neurotransmitter, and a scaffolding apparatus, as shown here, that pulls everything together. Now, I'm not going to talk about this today. We have published widely on it. We've published widely on it, and you can read about it in the literature. You can read about it in textbooks. And it's not something we actually work on anymore because that was the past. What we're now trying to understand is how nerve cells actually know who to talk to, how they know how to form a network, a circuit. But as I mentioned, this is not what I'm going to discuss with you today. What I'm going to talk about today is to try to address my personal view, my personal answer to the question whether there is a reproducibility or even a fraud crisis in science. And the reason why we became interested in this subject is twofold. One reason is that President Donald Trump issued an executive order in May of last year, which basically claims, as shown here, that over the last 5 years, confidence that scientists act in the best interests of the public has fallen significantly. A majority of researchers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics believe science is facing a reproducibility crisis. The falsification of data by leading researchers has led to high-profile retractions of federally funded research. So the accusation or the tone here is that, as issued in an executive order by the President of the United States, that science is basically fraudulent and that publicly spent money is used to fundamentally commit fraud, that there's a crisis. This executive order and the Trump administration have already had a major impact on science in the United States. Interesting. Okay. Oops. Maybe I need to wave this or something. Okay. As exemplified in this article in The Economist, a financial journal based in the United Kingdom, which, for example, reported the case of an NIH researcher, as shown here, Kevin Hall, who was asked to change a section of a paper that he had written because it used the wrong word for the administration. He then was asked to change an entire message of a paper, and it was edited without his perusal. And NIH, this doesn't work very well. Okay. Had no comment. I think this is sort of an illustration of what is currently happening. The new policies translate into political action in the United States that are based on this new view of science, which, as another example, has led, for example, to a complete change of vaccination policies in the United States under the leadership of R.F. Kennedy as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So in some ways, science is indeed in a crisis, as articulated in this executive order. And what I wanted to discuss with you today is, what is this crisis and how can we possibly address it? How can we actually deal with it? Because I do think, as I hope to communicate, that there is a crisis in some sense, although, as I would also like to communicate, I believe the crisis is a little different from the way it was phrased in the executive order. I believe the crisis, at least in the United States, is more an organizational crisis of how science is organized, and not a crisis that scientists are inherently fraudulent. So, what I would like to discuss, how much fraud is there in science, and is there a reproducibility crisis that is caused by fraud? And my thesis is that current scientific practice faces major structural problems, but only minor issues with reproducibility and of fraud. The major structural problems, however, are pervasive and deleterious. I would like to start with a section that tries to convince you that there is little evidence of true fraud. Instead, the evidence exposes other problems in science: human errors, technical errors, overreach in publications. And this section is greatly motivated by my own personal experience, because recent revelations about my own lab have revealed that we have made errors. Human errors, because we are human, but errors. A year ago, a little more than a year ago, Science published an article on our research, as you can see here. And the key point of this article was that a public social media website called Papier basically flagged, which means criticized, accused us of fraud, of more than 30 of our papers. The word flagged is kind of used here to indicate that there's something wrong, to insinuate that there is potentially a problem. But it's used also in a way so that it can't be directly mean anything specific. So who are the people on Papier who are accusing us? And what are these accusations? And the key person is Dr. Elizabeth Big, assisted by Dr. Leonid Schneider, who have basically led a team that has accused us, as you can see here, and specifically more than 30 of my trainees, of making not only mistakes, but actually manipulating data. Now, this came in a wave, and it was a huge problem for us. Because the fact is, as I will tell you, that we actually did make mistakes. However, most of the accusations were rather trivial. For example, here is one of Dr. Big's accusation on a paper, as you can see here, that was published some years ago. I am the only author from Stanford. And so I was accused of being what's called an honorary author, of putting my name on a paper to which I contributed nothing, which is misconduct. We don't do that. But it turns out that this paper was actually led by a senior author, Anton Maximov, who was a postdoc in my lab when he did most of the work. And he then just moved and published the paper from his new institution. So most of the work was actually done in my lab. It would have been easy enough to see that. There are lots of accusations like this flagging papers. However, we did make 21 mistakes. Let me illustrate some of them. For example, here, what you see here are two images. They're different. They are different. But when J.R. Wang, a postdoc, composed this figure, she accidentally pasted the same image twice. Copy-paste mistake, typical. So this is a classical image problem. This paper has more than 300 images, more than 130 graphs. Once she mistakenly copy-pasted the same picture twice, there's no way she could have seen it, nor could have anybody else seen it, because you don't see it with your eyes. You need AI to see these kinds of things. Another example, which I find particularly instructive, is this one here. This paper was flagged, criticized of fraud, because in the materials and methods, the postdoc who wrote the materials and methods made copy-paste mistakes in the catalog numbers. He used the same catalog number 3 times because he basically copy-paste mistakes happen all the time. And he didn't notice it, and nobody noticed it until AI found it. So these are the typical mistakes. What is the origin of these mistakes? So we were wondering about this because we were concerned about these mistakes because they seemed to indicate the possible problem, especially since there were more than 20 such mistakes, copy-paste mistakes. What you see here is a graph of our publications in green over the last 30, 40 years, and mistakes as they happened. And you can see that before the start of digital image pasting, you know, when you copy paste images or numbers or text, there were only 2 mistakes. Afterwards, there's a wave of mistakes, a third of which is actually not ours, although we were accused of it, but of collaborators who made that mistake. When this AI image analysis started, these mistakes all of a sudden became visible. Nobody saw them before. And then Papier started to criticize us. That's how all this unfolded. Copy-paste errors in our papers thus started when we began to assemble digital images and stopped when AI enabled us to determine errors before publication. I have to confess that even afterwards, we discovered copy-paste mistakes in manuscripts that we then corrected before they were published, because now we use the same AI tools. But this is the basis for a lot of accusations, I believe, of science integrity, critics in the field. When you plot the number of trainees versus the number of mistakes, you can see that the majority of trainees from my lab never made a mistake. That about 15 made one mistake. A few made 2 mistakes, and actually 2 or 3 of them made 3 mistakes. So it distributes over a large number of people, each of whom acknowledges that they made these mistakes. All of these allegations and errors are discussed in detail on our website if you care to look. These errors are being corrected, although I find this pointless because nobody would see them without AI. They're just not visible, okay? But still, journals insist that these are flagged and that it needs to be corrected. So why would people do this? Why would people spend this amount of time? The reason why people spend this amount of time, especially Dr. Bick, is because that is their profession. That is basically how they make a living. Some of these mistakes are indeed more complicated than just copy-paste mistakes. And I think that those mistakes are probably the ones that have caused the most problems in the field. And I want to provide one particular example in discussing our own work, a paper that we published 15 years ago or 16 years ago about an active zone protein, as shown here. And Papier discovered that in one of the more than 100 plots in this paper, there is in the supplementary materials 2 blots that have a very weird pattern of microduplications. You can see these here. And in fact, these types of microduplications are often observed in the literature. Literally hundreds of papers have these types of microduplications. And so the accusation was that these microduplications are inserted on purpose to cover up bands, to cover up results that was supposed to be covered up. This makes no sense because you could just run a blot without loading anything with an empty lane if you wanted to have an empty blot, as shown here. But it also makes no sense because when you actually trace the position of these duplications, they don't correspond to bends at all. Nevertheless, in our culture at the present time, journals take this very, very seriously because they are very much scared of the public recriminations of Papier, of Dr. Bick, and other agencies. So they want to do everything they can to appear to be rigorous, even if they aren't. They say they understand they're likely artifacts, but they still feel that they need to publish an editorial expression of concern, even though they acknowledge their artifacts. I think that this is one of the big problems we face, because at least for junior people in my lab, and certainly in other labs as well, they ask themselves, why should we do all this? Why should we go through this work? Why should we do all this, go through science, if we are treated from the social media, from the politicians, and from the journals like this? Why should we accept this? Problems for those of you who are in science and that you might face in your careers is that we as a scientists are basically powerless via the financial interests of the journals, of the Papier commenters who make the money based on how many comments they can publicize, the politicians, and the funders. The flagging of papers is obviously more lucrative for Papier professionals when they target high-profile scientists like myself. It's not very useful if they do this for an assistant professor who is just starting But nevertheless, there is a general atmosphere, at least among parts of the scientific community in the United States now, that scientists are being basically watched to an extent that even minor mistakes become amplified into major problems that in the end are reflected in the executive order of President Donald Trump. Now, you could say that there's a positives in this endeavor because, after all, there are mistakes in the literature. These mistakes in this window of about 20 years before the advent of AI that can now be discovered by AI. And you could argue that it's necessary to correct these mistakes even if nobody sees these mistakes. Question is that really so? And are the negative consequences of pursuing minor mistakes as opposed to true manipulations of data not significant enough to be a bit more cautious and to especially require from journals to have an ethical standard that doesn't only absolve themselves, but also regards the interests of science itself? Indeed, it has become incredibly successful for peer commenters to do this. This is how they make their income. An organization in Berlin, for example, called the Einstein Foundation, which is to me an ironic name for this organization, recognized Dr. Big's work with a prize giving her 200,000 euro as an integrity award. She donated the money to a foundation that she controls because she didn't need it, and in response was appointed by Stanford as a faculty affiliate. So she's now my colleague. So the question arises, one of the bigger questions arises, what kinds of purity in science do we need? What kinds of standards should we have? And especially since this is arguably a historical phase. This didn't happen, these kinds of mistakes, before digital pasting. It won't happen in future because the same AI tools can detect the mistakes before they're actually published. So they won't happen in future. So is this really something that we need to be concerned about? Or are there other problems in science, structural problems, that are more significant than this? And I would like to argue that there are other problems in science that are not easily detected by AI, actually not detected at all by AI, but that we as scientists need to be concerned about. And one of them, what I would call is technical errors that are overlooked by authors, editors, and reviewers. A problem that we have in our current publishing system in the science culture is that peer review quality has arguably decreased because the volume of publications has increased. And I would like to give you some examples that illustrate that the lack of expertise by authors, reviewers, and editors is actually a problem. For example, what you see here in this paper is, it's a Nature paper of all places, that mutations in orexin 1, a gene that we discovered and have extensively studied over the years, cause a decrease in synapse numbers. And this is statistically significant, as you can see here in this figure. It is statistically highly significant. The p-value is very high. But this conclusion is based on pseudo-replicates with a change that is less than 10%. In other words, not the number of experiments, but the number of images that is used to create the statistics. This is the standard in the field. To arrive at major conclusions based on data that are pseudo-replicates is a problem, especially if the effect size is small. This is another paper published in Yuan. And as you can see here, there's many graphs here with high degree of statistics. Look at this. What you wouldn't know when you don't read the methods very, very carefully is that the experiment was apparently only done once. The statistics is based on pseudo-replicates. If you take enough images, the ends goes up. And this kind of thing happens all the time. In fact, here too, our own work was questions on papier flagged, so to speak. We published a paper a couple of years ago in Nature on spatial transcriptomics, actually a year ago. And not long afterwards, it was alleged that the statistics was wrong because in transcriptomics, again, statistics is based on pseudo-replicates, not on true replicates. That's the standard of the field, and that's what everybody does. That's what we did. And so the accusation was that when you do this based on this true replicates, that there is little true positives. So we had to go back and reanalyze all these data and respond. And when we reanalyze the data using different level of statistical rigor, as shown here in these volcano plots, I don't know if you're familiar with those, but basically they show you statistical significance if you are sort of in the corners up and down on the right and left side. Okay, as you become more and more rigorous, fewer and fewer genes are still statistically significant. But even at the most rigorous level, shown at the bottom right, there's still significant genes. So the question always arises, what exactly here is the most rigorous, the best way of doing this? I think that this is for the field to decide. This is not fraud. This is a technical question. My own personal opinion is that probably the use of in transcriptomics, RNA-seq or spatial transcriptomics of using single data points as the end for statistics is probably not a good idea, even though that's the standard. But I also think that it is going to be impossible to use the same statistics for transcriptomics as you do, for example, for behavior, where each animal is the n of basis of n. We have to basically adjust the statistics to the experimental design and use some common sense, especially if changes that are alleged to be specific are validated independently by a different method, as they should be and as they were. Then there's another problem, I think, that's even more pervasive, I believe, in science that we currently have in the science publishing culture. It's the problem that I call overreach, which is basically that the data are all fine, the statistics is fine, but the data are used to make a conclusion that is really not possible based on the data. And I want to give you one example again from my own field. Since we are very interested in transcriptomics, we were interested in this paper that was published, I think, in Nature Methods, which basically claimed to have profiled individual synapses by transcriptomics. Now, that is a fantastic claim. If you could imagine that you could actually get the RNA, mRNA complement, the expression profile of individual synapses, would be fantastic. But when you look at the paper, this is what they do. They take frozen brain samples, mash them up, which causes a vesiculation of all the membranes in the okay? Then they pellet them And then they take the individual vesiculated membranes and test whether or not they have DNA. And if they don't have DNA, they're not from the nucleus. And then they do RNA-seq on the ones that don't have DNA. So what they actually do is not profile individual synapses. They're basically profiling cytoplasm in the brain. Not surprisingly, nice tone. Surprisingly, there's lots of synaptic genes because synaptic genes are most abundant neuronal genes, among the most abundant neuronal genes. But this is not droplet-based transcriptomics of individual synapses. So this is typical. We see this a lot. And there is no way to police this. There is no way. It's not fraud. It's basically an oversight by editors and reviewers, which again is a problem of the current way how we in science publish papers, publish results. Now we move on to the next part. The next reason why I believe that current scientific practice faces major structural problems, but only minor issues with reproducibility or fraud. And that is that scientific results are inherently variable. This is not a reproducibility issue. It is an issue of assessing a scientific paradigm, a scientific design of an experiment. And I wanted to just illustrate this again with a single example, a historical example that is of great significance in neuroscience, the so-called LTP wars. LTP is a long-lasting change in the strength of synapses induced by the previous use. It was discovered by Bliss and Lomo, and it is generally thought to be the basis of learning and memory. It's been discovered more than 50 years ago. About 25 years ago, there was a big discussion of how LTP, that is dependent on NMDA receptors in the hippocampus, how that type of LTP is actually induced. And there were papers in Nature, as shown here, that claimed that it was induced either by a presynaptic change in the neurotransmitter release machinery or a postsynaptic change in the neurotransmitter receptor machinery. These papers are incompatible with each other, but they are not a lack of reproducibility. They are not fraud. They're probably both right because synapses are just very complex. I don't think either one of them is wrong in its conclusions. They're both rigorously done, and there were many papers like this. This is not a sign of irreproducibility. Science is inherently variable because everything depends on the precise experimental design. Depending on the design, results are different. We have to communicate to the public that scientists never claim to have the absolute truth, and that any scientific conclusion, any scientific result is always relative to the actual experiment that was being done. My next thesis is that what fraud exists is mostly crude and confirmatory. I'm not going to go into detail here. Suffice it to say, for example, that the type of image analysis that I discussed that confirm other papers, it is a problem, but it cannot usually be discovered by AI because fraud is usually done in a way that it's not being discoverable. It's been claimed that the fact that there's so many retractions in the literature is evidence that fraud is rampant. thousands of papers are being retracted. In fact, we're currently doing an analysis of these retracted papers in the literature to find out better in quantitative terms of what actually is happening. Now, when you just look at the number of thousands of papers, that sounds like a lot. But then when you realize that there are 25,000 scientific journals annually, okay? Journals, not papers. There are hundreds of thousands of papers annually. Thousands of papers doesn't sound so bad. It's only a tiny percentage. Moreover, this analysis that is probably true. Oops, what happened? This doesn't work anymore. Okay. Can you hear me? Does this work? Okay. So this paper that I'm citing here alleges that a large percentage of scientists admit that they have fabricated, falsified, or modified data. The problem with this is that if you ask me if I modified data, of course I modified data. We process data all the time. What does modified mean? It's really not fabricated and falsified. It's falsified, fabricated, and modified. The question then is modified fraud? When is modification of data fraud? How original, how raw are data that are being presented in papers? What is correct? How much image analysis, for example, are you allowed to do before it's becoming incorrect? These kinds of questions need to be addressed. It's a very, very slippery slope. There's a huge community out there that basically promotes fraud as a business model instead of trying to police fraud. Fraud undoubtedly exists and obviously cannot be tolerated. But science is a human activity and cannot be made pure. It's never going to be error-free. It's never going to be perfect. No scientific conclusion will ever be final. There will always be updates, always be changes. Also, as I just mentioned, the number of retractions doesn't mean anything because the vast majority of papers are in journals that are never cited. And the percentage of papers that are being retracted is actually less than 1 in 1,000 or less than 1 in 10,000 papers. So it is minuscule. So how might we be able to address these problems? What might we need to do? And so the biggest issue, I believe, is how we communicate science. Many scientists realize that this is a problem. The current journal system, in many ways, doesn't work the way it was designed. It doesn't work for a number of reasons. One is that journals obviously want to make money. Another is that it's difficult to get qualified peer reviewers. The third is that there's no regulation. The journal system is the largest unregulated industry. We do need a peer-reviewed publication system to communicate science. It's absolutely essential. But the current organization of science publishing is questionable. Peer-reviewed open access journals proliferate enormously. There's more than 3 million papers published per year. So my hundreds of thousands I mentioned earlier were actually a total underestimate. Publishers like Frontiers publish hundreds of different journals. Elsevier has almost 3,000 different journals. Okay. The profits of journal publishing is enormous, very, very high, because peer review is for free. So there's a huge problem. There is no regulation that dictates how a journal is supposed to do peer review. Anybody can start a journal tomorrow, open a website, and solicit papers. Sorry, at any time. No problem. So this is, I think, one of the biggest issues, an issue that, for example, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute has realized. Howard Hughes Medical Institute is my employer. So in evaluating my performance, they no longer in future look at any published papers, but will only evaluate preprints to get around the issue that the publication system is so messed up everywhere. It is actually kind of ironic that anybody can start a scientific journal, charge money, and publish peer-reviewed papers. There's no accountability. This is not fraud, but it clearly doesn't promote quality. And on top of that, nobody can actually read all these papers. It is impossible at this point. One is that instead of paying when a paper is published, authors could pay when they submit a paper. And then the journal has an obligation to perform rigorous peer review. Reviewers should be Nature, Cell, and Science fact biased, which I do to some extent agree. If papers that are rejected are assessed properly and the reviews, but we could see whether these errors. Editors are the gatekeepers of journals. There is no accountability of editors or of the ethics of editors. Editors are not very well paid and they have a job to keep. Their interest is not necessarily the interest of science. Their interest is different often. There needs to be accountability not only of authors, but also of editors, the decisions they make, the reasons for these decisions, whether they are scientifically ethical. In my experience, editors work incredibly hard and try to do the best they can, but sometimes, not infrequently, especially with these more prestigious journals, they tend to also follow less the science and more other criteria, to put it this way. There should be mandatory post-publication assessments. The impact of a paper is not how many times it's cited, and is not reflected in the journal it's published. The impact of a paper is whether the ideas, concepts, and results it reports are actually used by others. And that does not necessarily become reflected in citations, because citations themselves are subject to manipulation. As you probably all know, there are, for example, these citation groups that always cite each other to increase their citations. In order to have post-publication assessment, one needs to look at the science. It's not possible to use bibliometric parameters. There should be priorities for follow-up studies. If somebody publishes a paper, to act. And finally, in some way we need to regulate peer reviews. We need to make sure that people actually in the scientific community actually do perform peer review. Many of my colleagues in the United States, for example, have never served on an NIH study section, which peer reviews grant applications. Many of my colleagues do not review papers. This is something we do as scientists, as a community service for free. It's maybe not. I do think people should be not only encouraged, but required to do this as part of a job as a scientist. Some of this is controversial. I'm happy to discuss it. Finally, I am facing more and more as I get older and more senior, the realization that not only in the United States, the career reward system for scientists is really not that great. We expect scientists to be really enthusiastic about science, to be interested, to want to do science, to have this as something that they're inherently curious about. And that is good. We do want all that. But scientists also have to live. They also have to have an income. They have to have a house they can live in. They have to have enough money to have a family. Only in the Bay Area where I live, which is extremely expensive, but everywhere. For example, postdocs are underpaid. There's no question. Stanford realizes this and has the highest postdoc salary, I think, in the United States. But they're still underpaid. The problem is that the labs don't have more money to pay them. A postdoc, relatively speaking, for the level of education is paid much less than, for example, a doctor or other professions. Now, you can tell a postdoc, well, this is a training period, and after 5 years, you'll become a assistant professor or industry scientist, and then you'll earn a lot more money. But even the postdocs who are most successful and who become professors are still not very well paid. What you see here is, again, taken from this website, ZipRecruiter, where you can see that the postdoc salary is followed by a professor salary in the Bay Area of around 130,000 per year. That's not a lot of money in America. Okay, that's the starting salary of a computer scientist out of college. Okay, so there is a discrepancy between the amount of work and the insecurity and the expertise that is required for a science career and the types of rewards that society offers. I often hear in the United States that the solution to that is to just give scientists the same amount of money, but have fewer scientists so they can all earn more. Again, that's a debatable solution, given the major problems we face in our societies as regards health, discoveries, medicines, advances in medicine, the major problems we face in trying to address key healthcare issues such as cancer or Alzheimer's disease. I'm not sure decreasing the scientific enterprise is a good idea, but that's a political decision. Finally, to compound the problem of low pay, biomedical scientists in academia have very little job security. In the United States, at least, even if you are tenured, you don't really have a secure job because your job can always be changed, always be eliminated. So how can we fix this? These are just suggestions. But I think the biggest issue that we have, at least in the United States, is that the elites in the United States, the political elites, the business elites, may not be aware of the role of science in society and, in fact, in the economy. The public often views scientists as privileged workers who want to play for free and without regard for society. They often think that scientists are not interested in translation, that they're not interested in actually making something, that they're just playing and that they do this for their own gratification. I hear this a lot. They're also often viewed as being unreliable or even crazy, do all kinds of strange things. I think nothing could be further from the truth. At least in the United States, nearly everybody in academia I meet would love to translate what they do as soon as they can. They would love to put it into practice. There's also a financial motive, but it's not only financial. I think most scientists, in fact, vast majority that I interact with, are really driven by the desire to contribute something that is beyond knowledge, that applies the knowledge. So I don't think this is at all true. And in some ways, it's our mistake as scientists that we haven't communicated this. Another issue is that, at least in the United States, many of us in science, including myself, are immigrants. We came to the States often only for a short period, and we never left. And so, as immigrants, we are also viewed not being quite reliable, maybe with some suspicion, which obviously I believe is totally wrong, because in the United States, at least, a lot of scientific innovation and technological innovation is driven by immigrants. In the United States, if you go back far enough, everybody is an immigrant, or almost everybody. The public perception of science has to change, as has, in particular, the perception of science by the current elites, which seem to think that science is dispensable for the economy of the country, and that scientists are not to be believed. And the problem in the United States, at least, has been that the scientific institutions, such as the National Academy of Sciences, have not done a good job in communicating this, in bringing this about, in standing up for scientists, pointing out what's important, what isn't important, and in making suggestions on how to solve some of these problems. Obviously, we as scientists and as members of the NAS have also the responsibility to share the blame here and to try to do something about it. So in closing, in this somewhat unusual talk, I try to convince you that in science, the way how science is organized internationally, globally, there is indeed a structural problem. It's not a misconduct problem. I hope I can convince you about this. And that structural problem has two root causes. One is the traditional organization of science publishing, science communication, of the communication of scientific results in journals. The other problem is the lack of communication that we as scientists have achieved, and our various organizations have achieved to transmit to the politicians, to the elites, to the business people, the need for an open, rigorous science culture that values scientists and that provides scientific results with the credibility that it deserves. I'd be happy to discuss this. I realize that some of this, what I said, may be controversial and that I may be wrong. I often am. But, you know, that's why we talk about things, in order to learn. And I'd like to learn from all of you. If there's anything that may be not quite correct, or if there's better ways of dealing with this problem that you might suggest. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Südhof. Very thought-provoking indeed. And it revolutionized a lot of our conventional view of science and scientific research paper publication systems. And now may we invite Professor Südhof to go back to the seat while our staff to set the stage. OK 啊，我们接下来先请我们的工作人员把我们座谈的沙发先就定位哦。The Q&A session will be moderated by President Tsai with academician Hong Mingqi and Professor Susan Hu opening the discussion. We have also collected questions from students in advance. And time permitting, the session will be open to questions from faculty members and students in the audience. 我们接下来的座谈将由亚洲大学蔡进发校长来担任主持人。那我们今天也非常荣幸邀请到我们的中央研究院院士洪明奇教授，以及我们的意见学院院长胡淑珍教授来进行提问以及互动。此外，我们事前也收集了一些学生的提问哦，那我们将视时间来开放现场师生进行交流。Okay, may we now invite President Tsai to serve as moderator and welcome Professor Thomas Südhof, academician Hong Mingqi, and Professor Susan Hu to the stage. 我们现在邀请蔡校长担任主持人，并邀请名誉博士 Südhof 教授、洪明奇院士以及胡淑珍院长一同上台。
Thank you for Professor Thomas Südhof for the excellent keynote speech. I think it addressed a very important problem, the scientific, the academic integrity and particular review system here, actually around the world. Yeah. And for the Q&A, I think our student or study actually your research. But many for tomorrow. But today is more general, talk about culture, general education. So we students have some question. And probably as a moderator, I have the privilege to ask the first question is that in Taiwan right now, we're very interested to see how we can have a more Nobel laureate. Since in Asia, the university, I think Japan, have 33 Nobel laureate. Every year, they all almost have 1 or 2. In Taiwan, that really educated in Taiwan, that we have the Enzer Lee, that's 1986 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Enzer Lee, he graduated from UC Berkeley, actually. And then maybe Samuel Ting in 1976, is right? In physics, yeah. So probably have 3, yeah. So there's a discussion here in government and also the research community that how we should do in higher education and also in the research academic, how we can produce more this Nobel Prize laureate. And during the discussion, I say our former president, China Management University, Hong Mingqi, he's also an academician and also our dean who. So that's a question. addressed to Professor Südhof, give us advice maybe to our government or the higher education or academic community that according to your experience in Germany, I think Göttingen produced the most Nobel Prize in Germany, I believe. And also your experience, most experience research is in the United States from the Texas Southwest Research Center and then the Stanford. Please give us advice, maybe to all the government, also the higher education or the university here. Please, Professor Südhof. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to give that advice. I can try to tell you my personal experience, which is that scientific innovation and scientific excellence requires two components. One is to have good universities with very high standards of teaching and high standards of laboratories, which I think you probably do have from what I understand in Taiwan. The other one is to have a lot of exchange with many other institutions, many other universities, laboratories. You would think that in our age of the internet, of Zoom, of email, scientific exchange should have gotten easier, but my experience is that if anything, it has gotten more difficult, because in the end, what happens is that the best and the most important exchange happens at personal levels when people talk to each other. Not by email, not by Zoom, but when people are together and discussing their interests and their experiences. I believe the United States has been extremely successful because it is such a large country with extensions into Canada, which serves as one big place where people talk to each other within the country and meet each other all the time. Europe has lost a lot of its scientific expertise over the last decades, I think, because it has become rather parcellated. You have little countries that are everywhere. And the European community has not yet created as much a scientific community that is unified as it should have. There's too much national segregation in Europe. And I can imagine that Taiwan as an island may also suffer from this limitation, that there are not enough, the critical mass is not, maybe not enough. So having frequent exchanges on a personal level with other countries would probably be useful. We've all watched the progress that is happening in China. I think they benefit tremendously from also being a large country with lots of different places and constant exchange. I think places like Europe and maybe Taiwan would benefit if they could actually have more exchange. So one observation that to me seems very important is that Japan has had quite a few Nobel laureates and has made enormous scientific contributions. But these are all in the past. The more recent developments in Japan seems to be much more limited because it seems that the exchange that Japan has had internationally has decreased dramatically over the last 2 decades. For example, the number of Japanese scientists going abroad for training, I think, has decreased 20-fold over the last 20 years. And that obviously has very negative consequences. The most important feature of science is communication between scientists. And that requires constant exchanges, constant meetings, constant interactions.
Thank you. I think the probably President Huang probably can follow up.
First, thanks for coming and welcome to Taiwan. And we used to see each other in Singapore, but now we switch to Taiwan. And when Jeffrey asked you a question about advice Taiwan, and you very humbly say you don't know how to do it, but you will try. The best way is to come to visit us more often. Agree? If you agree, hold hands. And I do see that there are a lot of there are some questions here, but before that, I would like to share with you that when you gave a talk just earlier, I was very touched because those journal issue is a reality, but we don't know how to deal with that. For example, PubPeer or every journal, and when we do experiment, we write a manuscript, we submit it, it's all peer review. Regardless, different journal may have a different peer review. But PubPeer, Dr. Pick, your friend, PubPeer, everybody can send something question there. And then that question that the person doesn't have to identify who this person is. And then once it's appear there, you know, as a scientist, we feel the application to answer the question. And if those questions or those people who are a qualified scientist, that's fine. But I'm sure many of them, they are not qualified scientists, because I have one experience in PubPeer. And here was a question that what come from our own publication, 2 different published different subject. And how come the results are different from the same lab? Then I went in to see it. Wait a minute, method is different. One is using immunocompetent mice. The other one is using immunocompetent mice, skin mice. Of course, they are different, right? And this person does not even know it. And so we could answer that, and then they will come back with some sort of very naive, like a biochemistry 101 question. So I'm not sure. So later on, I told this person, say, some of this question, you may, I think at that time, I kind of realized he's not a professor. I didn't may not even a postdoc. I say, you should ask your mentor. So that's kind of share with what I feel that because I don't know how to say. And the other point you mentioned that peer review. When I remember when I was young, well, we are still young right now, but when we were younger at that time, 30 years ago, whenever we were invited as a journal editor, cancer cell invited me as a journal editor, a molecular cell invited as a journal editor, we feel it is an honor. But nowadays, when we become older now, and now, as you pointed out, those journal, predatory journal, I don't want to say which one, but those, there are some predatory journal, they come up with so many different journals. Now, every day, I'm sure you experience that. You have a few invitations for review paper. And of course, if those invitation is from predatory journal, it's very easy, we just reject it, right? But even that, even reject that, almost every day, you will be invited to review a paper. And so as you pointed out that not enough qualified reviewer to review the paper. And therefore, the point you mentioned a lot of interesting points, and as you pointed out, it is there may not be a direct answer right now, but or some of them may be contradictory. But still, I thought review is a free review, right? But if you will become so heavy, and I know some journal, for example, Cancer Research, that they start to give if you review the paper for them, then if you review a certain number, then they give you a kind of a right, say, oh, if you review so many papers for us in 1 year, then next year, your paper will guarantee send out for review. It doesn't say it's accepted, but you send out for review. But otherwise, they say we no review, send back to you, something like that. So I thought you pointed out many points, and I think the scientific community need to face that. This is scientific industry that how we're going to fix that. And I was really, I never heard a talk like this. And most of the time people talk about scientific stuff, but these are very important issues that we have to face. But nobody really, well, of course, you're different. You're Nobel laureate. You can say whatever you want to say. Anyway, but it was really impressive. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's a huge problem. I think we cannot solve here, but we'll continue this discussion, and we're open to the floor to ask question. Who want to ask question? Okay, yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, President Tsai, for the opportunity to ask this question. And to Asia University, thank you for giving us the opportunity to be in the presence of a Nobel laureate. Professor Thomas Südhof, thank you very much for that very honest and thought-provoking talk. My question is with regard to AI. So my name is Earl. I'm a student here at Asia University. AI now is being used much more extensively by students, and it is my personal purview that AI somehow can compromise academic integrity, especially when there's over-reliance on the use of AI. So my question is for Professor Südhof, how do you think students or researchers can responsibly use AI to balance efficiency and academic integrity? So how can we use, in your personal experience or in your personal practice, how do you use AI without necessarily compromising academic integrity and excellence? Thank you.
That's a great question because it's regards a number of different issues. On the one extreme, with AI, you can create any kind of fake data you want. As a result, raw data that we now all make public are not necessarily true. And this is something we have to acknowledge. There's no way the scientific community can be sure that raw data that are available are actually true data, because AI can create anything you want. Any image, anything can just be created. Yeah. So that's one extreme. And the solution to that extreme is partly I try to address in my presentation is by, I believe, following up concepts, not trying to reproduce exact experiments, but to reproduce conclusions, to test conclusions continuously by different people from different perspectives. That's one extreme. The other extreme is the question of, for example, students, but also scientific authors just using AI to write proposals, to write essays, to write papers without much input from the authors themselves. I think that is a potential problem, but my personal experience is that very often what comes out of it is not usable as such, but has to be then edited by a person, because AI is often wrong. Especially in science, I find that AI mostly at best skims the surface and often uncritically takes over whatever it finds in the vast internet sphere. We all know that a lot that's out there, especially in the 20,000 plus journals in science that are never cited, sometimes referred to as paper mills or predatory journals, that a lot that's out there is simply not true. We ignore it, but AI doesn't. AI takes it as truth. And therefore, a lot of the stuff that comes out of AI searches when you have ChatGPT or something like this. So a student who just relies on text created by AI or a scientist who relies on it, anybody who knows the field can detect that very easily. So I think that we need to teach our students and to teach ourselves, and I have to teach myself too, how to use ChatGPT in a way that it's useful, but that we don't become misled, that we have to use it as a kind of, if you want, assistant, as an agency that can help us put things together, put information together, quickly retrieve information. But in the end, we have to go back in and really look at everything in detail, go back in and look at what's actually true, what isn't true, reformulate what's being said. AI is the best for things like letters and things like this, but when it goes into more content, those people who rely on AI to write their papers or their essays are endangering their careers.
Wonderful. Yeah, definitely. AI is it's very powerful, but we have to be very careful how to use it. Now, what's the question? 佩蓉老师在哪边? Okay, please.
Thanks for Dr. Thomas Südhof reflective and inspiring speech. I'm an associate professor of physical therapy department in Asia University. And my question is, what advice would you give young researchers facing uncertain challenges during scientific field? Thank you.
You know, again, I don't know if I'm qualified here because when I was young, your age, things were different. I do think that very often it is said when this question is asked to a Nobel laureate, I've heard it many, many times, follow your passion, follow your interests. And there's some truth in that. But I've always felt that that advice in itself may be a bit disingenuous because most of us don't have the privilege to follow our passions and our interests. It's just not a freedom that many of us have. I think the most important decision in a scientific career is the kinds of people you choose to work with, to learn from, especially what kinds of mentors, what kinds of institutions. My personal scientific career was greatly inspired by the teachers I've had in science and outside of science, in music and other fields. I'm not sure that was necessarily due to any kind of intelligent decision on my side. I think it was more luck. But the one lesson I took from that is that any kind of young scientist, whatever her or his interests, whatever her or his career aspirations, the people you work with, especially the mentors, are the most important determinant of not only a career, but also of a satisfaction with a profession. And so I would think that that's the most important aspect of any career that I would pay attention to as a young scientist.
Wonderful. I want to follow a little bit. No, I followed this Perron's question since the professor sort of talk about who you work with, and you leave Germany, go to Texas to study with two professors, right? That's one thing, and I think I read some information that the teacher who have great impact on you is your music teacher, for some teachers, right? So could you elaborate more on those two aspects? To Texas, what's the issue? There's many institutions in the United States. Why you go to work with those two professors?
Yes, that they will get the Nobel Laureate Nobel Prize before we go to there.
No, no, I did not. So after I finished my medical degree and finished my internship in medicine, I decided to pursue postdoctoral training, and I decided to go to Dallas, Texas, which wasn't exactly an attractive place. Then is even less of an attractive place now. And I went there specifically to work with Joe Goldstein and Mike Brown. I did that because at that point they were publishing papers on using molecular approaches in cell biology, and I felt that that was fascinating, but more so I visited them before I made a choice, and I was inspired by my discussions with them about their interest in science, what they wanted to do. That's why I chose to go there instead of going to a more famous place. I was obviously in many ways lucky because they won a Nobel Prize while I was there, partly with work that I had done, and well-deserved, and have been an inspiration for me ever since. So I consider that was probably one of the best choices I've made in my career. And that certainly is one of the reasons why I think that as young scientists, making choices of the mentors is a very, very important decision.
What about a music teacher?
So when I grew up, as you all know, I'm German. I was fascinated by music, by classical music. I still am. I had a music teacher who I trained with. Unfortunately, I didn't have the talent, to be honest. Otherwise, I would probably have become a musician and not a scientist. It's probably a lot more difficult to be successful in music than to be successful in science. But what music shares with science, and possibly with every profession, is that without a detailed mastery of the actual execution, in this case of playing an instrument, which requires hours and hours and hours of practice, you cannot be a good musician. But the detailed mastery of an instrument alone doesn't make you a good musician. In science, it's the same. In that, in science, if you don't actually have a deep understanding of experiments, of the subject, you won't be able to make major discoveries. But being an expert alone doesn't make you a good scientist. It makes you still a very useful scientist. It's still very important, for example, for evaluating science. But a brilliant scientist needs to be more than an expert. he or she also needs to have the ability to use the expertise for advances that go beyond the expertise. I often say that in order to think outside of the box, you have to have a box first, because otherwise you can't think outside of the box, right?
That's really, really inspired, this advice. And next, go to Ming Lao.
Professor Thomas Südhof, thank you for your so wonderful speech. My name is Sena. I'm a teacher at Asia University. My question is, the research is so specialized nowadays. How can we help students focus on the tiny details without losing sight of the big picture across different fields and the spaces, much like you did in your own work? Thank you, appreciate.
It's true that science is specialized nowadays. It's true that there's a lot more detail than there ever was because there's more knowledge. But you know, it's also true that there are a lot of resources now where you can get very quickly an overview of a field, at least in broad strokes. The problem is to find the right place to which you can trust, the right source of information. So for example, I generally find Wikipedia useful. You don't need to know the details to get an overview of a field, to get an idea of what's happening, of where things are. I think that we should encourage our students, and I try to do this as much as I can, to be an expert in one field, but a generalist in many fields. And I think that we should require our students to have to basically research general areas so they can acquire the skill of quickly getting an overview of a certain question. I think that that's entirely possible. It's much more possible now than it used to be. You know, in the old days, before, in the pre-digital age, there used to be all these encyclopedias, like Encyclopedia Britannica and all this. I don't know if some of you remember. They don't exist anymore because nowadays all this is online. You can very quickly, if you want to understand, for example, where, let's say, cancer research is now with respect to tyrosine kinase pathways. For example, you can relatively quickly get a pretty good overview of where you are and where things are. You won't know what the latest drugs are. You won't know which kinase is the most important for what cancer, but you will get a pretty good view. So I don't think I think that in many cases in our education, we are not requiring students to also be general. We are only requiring them to be very special, and that is wrong. So I do think that that's something that our education system needs to promote more. For example, in the United States, graduate students, they only have a year of courses and then they go into labs, and many of them never actually get exposed to anything because nobody urges them to become exposed. So I don't think that that's right. I think we need to expose students. We need to require students. We need to make them basically have familiarity with many broad fields, very broadly, many techniques, many approaches. They should know about fundamentals in, let's say, confocal microscopy and AI and behavior, if you're a biomedical scientist. It's very, very important. But also, I think it's entirely possible. It's not a big deal. I don't see it as a problem as long as we encourage the students to do that. The information is there.
Thank you. Go to Kylie 同学. Okay, please.
Hello, my name is Kelly. Thank you for your talk. I have a question. During your research career, have you ever experienced major setback? How did you cope with them and continue pursuing scientific research? Thank you.
Of course, we have experienced major setbacks. Everybody, I think, does, and I certainly have. There's no question about it. The most recent challenge we faced is a challenge I talked about, which is, having articles written about myself that so many papers are flagged did require a lot of soul searching, and I'm still in the process of trying to deal with the subject. I see it now as a broader problem in science in general of what we actually consider integrity and what we consider fraud, but that's something that's an ongoing issue. I believe that in science, even though I am very well paid, okay, so I have no complaints. We are underpaid. I have adult children, and my adult children make more money than I do, but they're not scientists. So they're not Nobel laureates. The only reason we do what we do is we believe that it is useful. It is useful to society, it's useful to the world, it's useful to culture. It's that belief has to have a reality. If we don't believe in what we do, we might as well get paid and not do anything. In terms of the setbacks, I think the way how I deal with them is to always go back and trying to understand myself, what I actually believe in what I do. And whether what I do actually provides value for somebody. Okay. And I do believe that science provides enormous value to humanity. And I hope that the science we do provides at least some value. And so that is what keeps me going. Because I do think that it's boring in life not to do something useful, and I don't want to be bored. Okay, and so I'm trying to do something useful. And if that attempt is frustrated, I try to go back to what is useful and try to do it better.
Follow this, 朱毅老师的例子，follow his, 朱毅老师在不在？ Yeah, please. Number 5.
Good afternoon, Professor Südhof. I'm Ziyi Wu from the Department of Occupational Therapy. It's a true honor to be here and listen to your speech. Thank you for reminding us in the world where everyone wants positive results, keeping academic integrity is the most essential quality. You also propose several possible solutions about today's publication situation. After hearing your sharing, I'm particularly curious, what is the most difficult thing for you to be a Nobel laureate? And how do you manage to keep your life normal despite all the fans? Thank you.
Okay.
I wish I was more famous, actually, but so I think my life is very normal. I think, and there isn't that much fame. So the biggest problem of being a Nobel laureate for me, as you may have gathered, is that as a Nobel laureate, I'm a bit unusual in that I received the prize not as a young man, but relatively younger than others. And I continue to do science as I did before without change. That has exposed me enormously to attacks and criticisms. There is not only money to be made from attacking my work, but also it makes people famous. and I think that kind of treatment is probably the most difficult part. Yeah. You know, I don't want to complain about it because first of all, we exposed ourselves to attacks by making mistakes. And second, it's a privilege to be a Nobel laureate, and many others deserve it. And so I've been lucky. But in daily life, it can sometimes be a bit difficult. Yeah. I wish that being a Nobel laureate would entail becoming wealthy. That hasn't happened yet. You know, you often read of these people, and I see it a lot. I live in an area where there's a lot of very wealthy people. But I can't take issue with the fact that, as I mentioned before, I'm well paid, and I take having this honor as also as a responsibility, which I'm trying to fulfill as much as I can, as best as I can.
听一下张同学的。Great.
Okay, Dr. Südhof, thank you for your wonderful talk. Reflecting on your personal journey, how has your perspective on scientific excellence evolved from when you were a graduate student to become a Nobel laureate? Thank you.
That is a very good question, because science has changed enormously. It changes continuously. It's not like it changed now and didn't change before. Science goes through revolutions all the time. We were in a previous revolution in many ways, in the molecular biology revolution, which happened in the 70s, 80s, and possibly beginning of the 90s, where the invention of molecular biology changed how biology was being done. It has totally changed science at that time. Prior to that, one could call it a biophysical revolution. Now, in the last decade, it's not, you might think it's the AI revolution. Well, AI is important, but it's much more than that. We are living in a time of revolution in the sense that now in all parts of biomedical research, the amount of data that are being gathered is enormous. And it's almost like AI was coming up at the right time, because at the same time as AI is coming up, all the other techniques that produce huge amounts of data that nobody could manually ever compute is also coming online. So we are living in a different type of revolution in the last 15 years in science that has changed how we do science and what excellence means, and and I don't think in this revolution we have learned yet how to actually deal with it. What I mean with this is, for example, in transcriptomics. So we do a lot of transcriptomics in our work, as does everybody else. It produces an enormous amount of data. As I already indicated in my talk, just the statistical analysis of these data is not straightforward. But not only the statistical analysis, even more so the biological biological conclusions that emerge from these data are totally unclear. So right now you'll see tons and tons of papers in Nature, including some of others, which basically say this gene is significant and that gene is significant and this pathway, okay, and it has all statistical significance. But let's face it, biologically, that's pretty meaningless. It's not really telling us much. We haven't yet learned on what to do with these data beyond crunching them, beyond basically putting them through AI and getting correlations. We haven't learned yet how to actually derive biologically meaningful conclusions from these vast amount of data, and that's just transcriptomics. The same thing is for imaging. There's lots of, imaging, there's so much data these days. It's unbelievable, yeah. So we are in this revolution, and excellence in this new phase of science will come from using these data in a biologically meaningful way, not publishing Nature papers, but using them to actually learn something about life, to learn something about a disease, to not just have a gene that's significant or a gene that's mutated, but actually understand how that affects the disease, how that makes the disease, or how that enables the process. That is where the challenges are. And that, I think, is what now defines excellence, as opposed to in the molecular biology revolution, where you had the challenge of identifying a gene that encodes a certain protein in a process that had been previously studied.
So we have a question more. The Professor Huang, you have. Okay. Yeah, please. The microphone.
Hello, Professor Sudo. I'm the student major in quantum chemistry in National Taiwan University. Thank you for your sharing today, and I'm really resonant with your sharing about the science crisis. Currently, I was reading Thomas Kuhn's writing. So my reflection to your speech today is that how can we change the perspective of the public to the science? The major challenge is the incommensurability. The science community and the society shares a different language, and the public assumes the science is a fixed truth. However, we all know that science is a continuous revolution. So I would like to ask you that for younger generation like us, we don't have the power to reshape the system. The current scientific issue is a kind of systematic crisis. So for the personal perspective, do you have any suggestions for younger generation? And how can we do to improve the system, or how can we communicate with the public? Thank you.
It's a very important question that I have struggled with, because many people think that because I'm a Nobel laureate, I might have influence or power. I don't. Okay, certainly in the United States, but also elsewhere, it's sometimes people listen, but most of the time they don't. I think we as a community, as a scientific community, not any individual, have made a large number of mistakes in terms of how we present ourselves to the public. For example, there has been in Europe years ago a very large, well-funded program that claimed that in neuroscience we could model a human brain computationally. That was even before AI. And that was claimed by neuroscientists who should have known better. Because there is no way you can model a human brain. At this point, you can't even model a C. elegans, which has 300 neurons. Okay, so it's just not true. scientists often come across as being egoistic because they always want more money, and as being a little bit crazy because they're interested in stuff that nobody else is interested in, and as being sort of self-gratifying because they want to only follow their own interests and nobody else's interests. This kind of perception is devastating because it destroys the public's trust. There are good examples against this. For example, the Nobel Prize that was given during the COVID time for RNA modifications. These RNA modifications were completely inspired by research that had no aim except for the interest, but turned out to be vital for the generation of vaccines. In the United States now, this is no longer considered a success, but anyway, that's a different issue. So that's a good example. Okay. In many ways, I think that there have been structural problems in the organization of science, some of which I tried to talk about, that are at fault here. And we as scientists, as the foot soldiers, need to try to influence the leaders, university presidents, politicians, deciders of the facts and who to trust. And that is very, very difficult. I agree. Yeah. One little thing is publication system. Nothing has been as deleterious for the scientific perception, for the public perception of science, as the fact that there are thousands and thousands of journals that publish peer-reviewed papers that have never been peer-reviewed and are totally wrong. Everybody can go into the internet and find a peer-reviewed result that fits their bias. It is not peer-reviewed. There was no real peer review. That is not science. But how is the public supposed to know? They see these journals with the titles, eminent titles, and they claim that they are peer-reviewed. They don't know that this isn't real science. So with this enormous confusion of what is actually true and what isn't true, even in science, that becomes a huge problem. And so in science, we need to be able to police scientific publishing. We need to have some degree of control over scientific publishing so the public knows what we as scientists actually think is true. Because the public doesn't know. They think that these are scientists that are publishing all this crap. Okay? And we as scientists have no power over science publishing, and that is wrong. And when you go back in history, the first scientific journal, I think, was published in 1664. This is more than 300 years ago, was published by scientists for scientists. This is no longer the case. We as scientists have lost control over science publishing in the last 100 years. And that is part of the problem. It's just part of the problem, but that is certainly one part of the problem that we can potentially address.
Okay, then probably last one, Gupta. Okay, thank you. It is very important matter you discuss and address. And one thing which is very important, but as an academician, I noticed I mean, there should be some regulatory or accountability from the publishing industry or indexing agencies' point of view, like Scopus, Web of Science, or I mean, different publishers, because slowly it is moving like industry. It is not like you mentioned in the previous questions. Earlier, it was, I
I'm publishing from scientists for the scientists, but now it is like many journals, like they publish 10,000, 15,000 papers, and sometimes it is really difficult to know actually it is really the reviews we are receiving from the genuine researcher or scientist, or it is just crafted by the journal editorial team or something. So I believe it is very important to regulate, which is no regulation, it is like a one-way traffic. So I think as a very high level of expertise, what you have and like your views is very important on this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I think two more students, right? Probably will give a chance. Yeah, please. Yeah. Or the last two. We are all over time already.
Okay, so hello. Thank you for your recognition. And I'm Marco. I'm currently a high school student. And you mentioned that like there's a lot of publication bias because like generally we want the p-value to be small and like people get to publish their theories, and then when they get published, they get tenure. And is there a way to solve this? For example, like removing the stars or like cross system, or like requiring like effect size, p-value, and like confidence interval simultaneously? Do you think that will help us to change like p-value from a threshold system to something that's more of a continuum? Thank you.
Yeah, p-values have been discussed a lot. My personal view is very simple. Statistics is an accessory. It's something that helps us. But in the end, a biological conclusions should not depend on p-values. It should depend on whether there is a compelling result or not. And I believe that most scientists would agree with this. And I also think that evaluation of science and scientists and papers doesn't depend on p-values. So I don't think that that's a really very important issue. It's more a detailed question that is specific for particular fields on how to deal with particular problems. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, probably you have a last call. Yeah.
Okay, hello guys. I'm currently in high school. My name is Owen. So I do want to bring the discussion back to your talk actually. So in your talk, you actually emphasize on a part where knowledge can be inherently changes over time as the science evolutes. I personally do highly agree on this point. However, I do want to bring the perspective back to the public trust. So usually when we're discussing about public trust, specifically in political involved topics such as public health, such as national securities, etc., it is often depending on perspectives on stability, on reliability, also government itself. So revisions in public sense, it is being often viewed not as revisions, not as improvement, but instead a mistake, a contradiction, or incompetence. So given that these structural tensions, how do you think that scientific institutions have communicates with government positions knowledge in a way that preserves public trusts and without overstating certainty? Thank you.
So there are many layers to this issue, and I think thank you for this question, because I think it's a great way to end this discussion. So on the one hand, on the one extreme, you have the continuous scientific process of not necessarily, wouldn't call it a revision, I would call it advances. So, for example, if you go from Newton to Einstein, let's call him German, okay. If you go from Newton to Einstein, Einstein didn't contradict Newton, but at the same time, he changed what Newton's physics is like, right? And I'm not a physicist, so Not that I understand what I'm talking about, but anyway, that's it. So just as an example. So that is a continuous process, and we need to communicate to the public that in science, at one level, the results that we have and agree on are immutably true, but that the advances don't really change the original conclusions. They in some way refine or transcend them. And that is obviously a difficult concept to communicate, but it's the best we can, because that's how the world is. We have a different problem, which I think is much more severe, and that we alluded to earlier, mentioned earlier, which is that there are major conclusions in the scientific literature that are contradictory and can't be both true. Whereas Newton's physics is still true. For example, if you say that, I don't know, so many people have that, let's say that measles vaccines cause autism. Okay, you have this in the scientific literature. It's out there, it's in peer-reviewed journals, okay? I believe that not to be true. I believe that it isn't true because there's lots of studies in epidemiology, which are, in my view, convincing, that show that this is not true. And the studies that show that this is true, to me, are not convincing because they're not scientifically well done. However, the public can't evaluate this because they don't have the training I have as a scientist. And you can't expect the public to have that training because not everybody can be a scientist. That's ridiculous, right? So it gets back to we as the scientific community need to get control over peer-reviewed publishing and what we as a community believe is peer-reviewed and can be viewed as a valid experiment. It could still be wrong, because after all, everybody makes mistakes, but it can't all be wrong, okay? And because we as a scientific community have lost totally control over science publishing, anybody can publish anything as a scientifically peer-reviewed article, the public no longer knows what's going on. And that is, I think, the most pressing, imminent issue that needs to be addressed. And that's not very complicated. It's not that sophisticated issue.
Okay, with that, I think I'm sure you have more questions. Tomorrow there's a panel. Bring your question. And I give a big applause to Professor Südhof for a wonderful speech and excellent dialogue advice to our Q&A session. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
May we also invite the 4 speakers on the stage for a group photo?我们待会会邀请我们现场所有的与会者一同进行大合照哦。All right, and now we invite our speakers to return to the audience sitting area to have group photos with all the participants.